Slow, heavy cinematic music builds tension. The most feared man in the Korean underworld. A man whose cold stare is a death sentence. Was suddenly paralyzed. Not by a bullet. Not by a betrayal. But because a 3-year-old girl in a bright red dress clutched a worn stuffed bunny in one hand, reached out with the other, and called him Daddy. Hyo Ji-hwan had never laid eyes on this child. In the back of the room, the maid's face went ghost white. His armed guards held their breath. The truth behind that one word will leave you absolutely speechless. Transition to a darker, rhythmic beat, the sound of a ticking clock or heavy footsteps. Hyo Ji-hwan didn't just rule an empire, he ruled through fear. From his high-rise headquarters to the darkest corners of the city, his reputation was one of iron and blood. At 33, he was a ghost, no family, no weaknesses, and a heart as sharp as his tailored black suits. He lived by one rule: attachments are a death sentence. But his rigid world was about to be dismantled by the most unlikely intruder. Julie Stonecipher, his new live-in housekeeper, was a shadow. She worked hard, kept her head down, and lived in the staff quarters with her daughter, Carla. Ji-hwan had barely acknowledged their existence. To him, they were just part of the furniture. That changed on a Tuesday morning. Ji-hwan was in the middle of a high-stakes meeting, a room full of hardened men discussing territory and power. When the heavy mahogany doors creaked open, a tiny girl wandered in. She didn't look at the guards. She didn't look at the luxury. She walked straight toward the most dangerous man in the room. As she wrapped her small, warm fingers around Ji-hwan's hand, the room turned into a tomb. "Daddy? You're home," she whispered, her eyes filled with a strange, deep recognition. At first, everyone assumed it was a toddler's innocent mistake. A cute, harmless moment of confusion. But as Ji-hwan looked down into her eyes, his expression didn't show annoyance. It showed terror. Because he realized the child wasn't just guessing. She was looking at him as if she had known him her entire life. And the reason why goes back to a secret buried years ago on a night Ji-hwan was never supposed to survive. Hyo Ji-hwan lived in a world where silence was a weapon and mercy was a myth. To the public, he was the enigmatic chairman of Hyo Enterprises, a man whose tailored black suits and razor-sharp features graced the covers of business magazines. But in the shadows of Seoul's elite district, he was known as the Dragon, the undisputed head of the Hyo Syndicate. His life was a masterclass in controlled precision. Every morning at precisely 5:00 a.m., Ji-hwan stood before a floor-to-ceiling mirror in his minimalist penthouse, adjusting a silver tie bar with fingers that had never trembled, even when they were stained with the consequences of his trade. For Ji-hwan, power was not just about wealth, it was about the absence of human friction. He had spent his early 30s building a fortress around his heart, replacing emotion with a cold, analytical efficiency. He didn't have friends, he had assets. He didn't have enemies. He had problems that eventually ceased to exist. His reputation for having a heart of stone was his greatest protection. In the brutal hierarchy of the underworld, any sign of warmth was an invitation for a blade, and Ji-hwan had survived this long because he was as impenetrable as the obsidian desk in his study. His home was an extension of this philosophy. A sprawling estate of cold marble and glass, it was a place of echoes and high-security protocols. The staff moved like ghosts, trained to be invisible. Among them was the newest addition, Julie Stonecipher, a quiet woman who had been hired through a rigorous screening process to manage the domestic affairs of the West Wing. Ji-hwan had noted her presence only as a line item in a report. He did not care for names, he only cared that the floors were polished to a mirror sheen and his black coffee was placed on the table at exactly 6:15 a.m. He believed his life was a perfected machine, a rigid cycle of high-stakes negotiations and calculated dominance. He was the king of a hollow mountain, sitting on an iron throne of his own making, convinced that he needed nothing and no one. He walked through his vast hallways with a predator's gait, eyes always scanning for threats, never imagining that the greatest disruption to his empire wouldn't come from a rival's bullet or a police raid. He was a man who had mastered every variable of fear, yet as he stepped out of his bedroom that morning, he was entirely unprepared for the tiny, red-clad silhouette waiting in the shadows of the corridor, a small variable that was about to shatter his cold, iron world. The heavy silence of the West Wing was usually broken only by the synchronized footsteps of Ji-hwan's security detail. This morning was no different, or so it seemed. As Ji-hwan emerged from his study, flanked by 4 men whose faces were masks of lethal indifference, the air felt thick with the gravity of an impending turf war. He was mid-sentence, issuing a cold directive about a shipment in Incheon, when the world simply stopped. There, standing amidst the cold shadows of the marble corridor, was a splash of defiant, vivid red. Carla stood no taller than Ji-hwan's knee. She looked impossibly small against the towering architecture of the estate, her curly hair a halo of soft chaos in a house of rigid lines. In her arms, she squeezed a stuffed bunny so worn that its fur had turned a dull gray, a stark contrast to the pristine luxury surrounding her. The bodyguards instinctively tensed, their hands hovering near their jackets, eyes darting for a threat. But there was no assassin, only a child with eyes as dark and deep as a midnight sea. Ji-hwan halted. His men stopped behind him like a falling row of dominoes, their confusion palpable. He looked down at the intruder, his brow furrowing into a sharp line of irritation. This was a breach of protocol. A lapse in security. He opened his mouth to call for the housekeeper, to demand that this distraction be removed immediately, but the words died in his throat. Carla didn't flinch at his towering height or the jagged scar that traced his jawline. Instead, a light ignited in her face. A pure, radiant recognition that didn't belong in a house of secrets. She took 2 wobbly steps forward, her tiny shoes clicking softly on the marble. Then, she reached out, her small hand catching the fine fabric of his trousers. "Daddy," she whispered. The word hit the hallway like a physical blow. The lead bodyguard, a man who had survived 3 assassination attempts without blinking, actually stepped back in shock. The air in the corridor seemed to vanish. Ji-hwan felt a strange, violent jolt in his chest, a sensation more jarring than any impact he had ever felt in a fight. It wasn't just the word, it was the way she said it, with a desperate, heartbreaking certainty. For a long, agonizing minute, the dragon of soul was speechless. He stared down at the small hand anchoring him to the floor, his heart hammering against ribs that had long since forgotten how to feel. In the distance, he heard the frantic, muffled gasp of Julie Stonecipher as she appeared at the end of the hall, her hands over her mouth in terror. But Ji-hwan couldn't look away from the girl. She wasn't guessing. She was claiming him. And for the first time in his life, the most dangerous man in the city felt his iron throne begin to crack. The silence that followed Carla's whisper was more suffocating than the humidity of a Seoul summer. Julie Stonecipher stood frozen at the end of the long corridor, her breath hitching in a throat tight with pure, unadulterated terror. She had spent months drilling the rules into her daughter's head: stay in the room. Don't go into the main hall. Never, ever touch the master. But there Carla was, her small hand like a beacon of warm blood against the cold, expensive wool of the dragon's trousers. Julie's heart thundered against her ribs as she finally broke her paralysis. She scrambled forward, her black and white uniform rustling sharply in the tomb-like quiet. Her mind raced through the horror stories she had heard about Hyo Ji-hwan, the man who had reportedly ordered the disappearance of business rivals and handled betrayals with a clinical, deadly precision. She fully expected him to shove the child aside or, worse, turn that icy, predatory gaze toward her to signal her immediate termination, or worse. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Hyo. Please, I don't know how she got out," Julie gasped, her voice trembling so violently she could barely form the words. She reached Carla and practically snatched the child into her arms, pulling her back with a desperate force. Carla let out a small, confused whimper as her stuffed bunny fell to the marble floor, forgotten. Julie kept her head bowed low, her eyes fixed on Ji-hwan's polished leather shoes, waiting for the storm. She waited for the cold reprimand, the dismissal, or the low, gravelly voice of his lead guard telling her to pack her things and leave before the sun set. But the explosion never came. Instead, there was only a lingering, heavy stillness. Julie risked a glance upward through her lashes and saw something that confused her even more than Carla's outburst. Ji-hwan hadn't moved. He stood exactly where he had been when the child touched him, his arms hanging stiffly at his sides. His face, usually an unreadable mask of stone, was fractured. His lips were slightly parted, and his eyes, those dark, lethal eyes, were fixed on the spot where Carla had just been standing. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost. His bodyguards glanced at one another, their hands twitching in uncertainty, waiting for a signal from their boss that didn't come. Ji-hwan's gaze slowly drifted down to the worn stuffed bunny lying on the floor. For a heartbeat, Julie thought he might crush it under his heel. Instead, he simply stared at it, his throat working as he swallowed hard. "Take her back to your quarters," he said finally. His voice was hollow, stripped of its usual razor-edged authority. Without another word, and without looking at Julie or the child again, he turned and walked toward his private office, his gait unusually heavy, leaving the maid trembling in the hallway with a daughter who was still reaching out, crying softly for a father she had never met. The following nights were a restless blur for Ji-hwan. The silence of his penthouse, once a sanctuary of control, now felt heavy and haunted. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back in that marble corridor, looking into the dark, liquid depths of Carla's eyes. There was a spark in them, a specific, defiant flicker of light, that felt like a phantom limb, a memory he couldn't quite grasp but couldn't stop feeling. He found himself sitting at his obsidian desk long after his associates had left, staring at the security feeds. He skipped past the perimeter checks and the gate logs, instead scrolling back to the footage of the staff quarters hallway. He watched the grainy black and white video of Carla sitting on a rug, meticulously brushing the ears of her worn stuffed bunny. Even through the digital distortion, that same intensity was there. It was a look of quiet, unwavering patience, the look of someone who knew a secret the rest of the world had forgotten. Ji-hwan poured a glass of neat whiskey, the amber liquid glowing under the dim office lights, but he didn't drink. His mind drifted back years, to a rainy night in a shipyard when he was still climbing the bloody ladder of the syndicate. He remembered the face of a man who had stood beside him, a man whose name was officially buried in the archives but whose presence had never truly left him. That man had the same spark. He had the same way of looking at a storm and refusing to flinch. Unable to sleep, Ji-hwan eventually stood and walked toward the west wing. He moved like a shadow, his silk robe whispering against the floor. He stopped outside the modest door of the housekeeper's quarters. He didn't knock, he simply stood there, listening to the soft, rhythmic sounds of a child's breathing from within. In that moment, the dragon of soul felt a terrifying crack in his armor. He realized that Carla wasn't just a child who had made a mistake. She was a living mirror. When she looked at him and called him Daddy, she wasn't seeing the billionaire or the Mafia boss. She was seeing something, or someone, he had spent a decade trying to bury. The familiarity in her eyes was a debt he hadn't known was due, a ghost that had finally tracked him down in his own fortress. As he stood in the dark, he realized with a sinking heart that his ironclad routine was over. The child had brought a light into his house that made his entire empire look like a heap of cold, gray ash. The dining room of the Hio estate was a chamber of cold elegance, tonight filled with the low, gravelly murmurs of men who dealt in the currency of power and intimidation. Ji-hwan sat at the head of the long obsidian table, the candlelight glinting off his silver cufflinks and the sharp edges of his glass. Across from him sat his lieutenants and a high-ranking associate from a rival faction, the air between them thick with the unspoken threats of a fragile peace treaty. Ji-hwan played his part to perfection, leaning back with an expression of bored detachment, his black suit blending into the shadows of the high-backed chair. He was the picture of the unshakable sovereign. Then, the heavy double doors at the far end of the room creaked open, just an inch. The men at the table went silent, their hands instinctively moving toward the holsters hidden beneath their jackets. Into the pool of warm light stepped a small figure in a bright red dress. Carla didn't seem to notice the dozen pairs of lethal eyes fixed upon her. She didn't see the scars, the weapons, or the tension that could snap a man's life in a heartbeat. She only saw the man at the head of the table. She walked forward with the clumsy, earnest gait of a toddler, her soft shoes pattering rhythmically against the hardwood. Julie was nowhere to be seen, likely a moment of lapsed vigilance during a bath or a nap, leaving the child to navigate this den of wolves alone. One of the lieutenants stood up to intercept her, his face a mask of iron, but Ji-hwan raised a single hand. The room froze. Carla reached the side of Ji-hwan's chair. She looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight. While the men in the room saw a boss to be feared, she saw something else entirely. She reached out, placing her worn, gray-furred stuffed bunny on the corner of the obsidian table, right next to Ji-hwan's hand. "You look sad, Daddy," she whispered, her voice small but piercingly clear in the silent hall. "Bunny helps me. He can help you too." The impact was more profound than any gunshot. A man who had just been discussing the cold mechanics of a hostile takeover now sat staring at a ragged toy offered in a gesture of pure, selfless love. The contrast was a visual wound, the bright, innocent red of her dress against the funeral black of his suit, the soft, tattered rabbit against the hard, polished stone of his table. Ji-hwan's throat tightened so much he could barely breathe. He felt the weight of his men's stares, the confusion, the sudden vulnerability of his image. But as he looked at Carla's expectant, innocent face, he didn't call for the guards. He didn't erupt in a rage. Slowly, his long, scarred fingers reached out and gently touched the matted fur of the bunny. For a fleeting second, the dragon of soul wasn't thinking about territories or blood. He was simply a man being offered a lifeline by a child who saw a soul beneath his armor. The warmth of the previous night had barely settled before the cold reality of Ji-hwan's world began to reassert itself. In the underworld, a change in temperature is never ignored, it is dissected for weakness. While Carla slept soundly in the staff quarters, clutching the stuffed bunny that had sat on the dragon's table, the security footage of that dinner was already being analyzed in a dark room miles away. The rival faction, led by a man whose bitterness toward the Hyo family spanned generations, didn't see a touching moment of humanity. They saw a crack in the armor. They saw the impossible. Hyo Ji-hwan, the man who had once burned down a warehouse to settle a minor debt, allowing a toddler to touch his hand without consequence. To them, Carla wasn't a child, she was a tactical vulnerability. "The dragon has grown a heart," the rival leader whispered, his eyes reflecting the blue light of the monitor as he paused the frame on Carla's red dress. "And hearts are so much easier to pierce than iron." Within hours, the machinery of a different kind of business began to grind. Phone calls were made over encrypted lines. Maps of the estate's secondary exits, the ones used by the domestic staff, were spread across tables. They noted the times Julie took Carla to the small garden behind the kitchens. They calculated the distance between the perimeter fence and the nursery windows. Ji-hwan, usually hyper-aware of the shifting winds, was preoccupied by a strange, new internal conflict. He found himself distracted during briefings, his gaze drifting to the corner of his desk where the bunny had briefly rested. He was beginning to consider things he had never once entertained. Schooling, safety protocols for a child, a life that didn't involve blood-stained ledgers. He didn't realize that by allowing himself to feel, he had inadvertently painted a target on the one thing he was beginning to cherish. The shadows around the estate were no longer just his allies, they were filling with eyes that weren't his own. A plan was taking shape, a kidnapping intended not just for ransom, but to force the dragon of soul to his knees. The piece that Carla had brought into the house was a fragile glass ornament, and the hammers were already being raised in the dark. The threat looming in the shadows drove Ji-hwan toward a compulsion he couldn't name. He needed to know why this child, out of all the people in the world, had the power to dismantle his defenses with a single look. In the dead of night, he retreated to the inner sanctum of his study, a room where the air was thick with the scent of old paper and expensive tobacco. Behind a hidden panel of reinforced steel sat his private safe, a repository of the secrets that kept the Heo Empire standing. He bypassed the ledgers of gold and the deeds to offshore accounts, reaching instead for a weathered, black leather folder marked only with a date from 5 years ago. It was the Incheon incident, a night of rain and betrayal that still haunted his scars. He flipped through the grainy surveillance photos and the redacted police reports until he reached the personnel file of the tactical unit that had protected him during the ambush. A single photograph fell out. Ji-hwan's breath hitched. It was a man in tactical gear, his helmet off, standing in front of the very docks where the blood had been spilled. The man had sharp features, a defiant spark in his eyes, and a smile that suggested he knew the risks of his life and accepted them anyway. But it wasn't the man's bravery that paralyzed Ji-hwan, it was his face. It was like looking into a mirror from another life. He looked at the name on the file, Kim Kong-dae. Beneath it, in a small, handwritten note from the estate's former head of security, was a list of dependents. Wife, Julie Stonecipher. Daughter, Carla. The realization was a silent explosion The realization was a silent explosion in the room. On that rainy night, when the rival clans had surrounded Ji-hwan, Kong-dae hadn't just been a guard, he had been a shield. When the final volley of gunfire erupted, Kong-dae had thrown himself in front of Ji-hwan, taking the bullets meant for the Dragon of Soul. He had died in a pool of saltwater and blood, his last words lost to the wind, saving a man who didn't even know his name. Ji-hwan leaned back, the paper trembling in his hands. Carla wasn't making a mistake. She was recognizing the face her father had worn, the face that Julie had surely shown her in faded photos, telling her that Daddy was a hero who had gone away to protect people. Carla had seen her father's ghost in the cold Mafia boss, and instead of fear, she had felt a homecoming. The debt Ji-hwan owed was no longer a matter of money or territory. It was a life for a life. He looked at the photo of the man who had died so he could live, and then at the door where he knew the man's daughter was sleeping. That nameless guard had a name, and his family was currently in the crosshairs of a war they didn't understand. For the first time in his life, Ji-hwan didn't feel like a king. He felt like a debtor, and he knew that the blood he had spilled in the past was nothing compared to the blood he was now willing to spill to keep Kong-dae's daughter safe. The predator had finally come for the lamb. It happened in the span of a single heartbeat, a shattered window in the staff quarters, a stifled scream from Julie, and the screech of tires echoing through the estate's secondary gate. By the time Ji-hwan reached the courtyard, the air was heavy with the smell of burnt rubber and the lingering scent of Carla's baby powder. He didn't call his lieutenants. He didn't wait for the tactical team. For the first time in a decade, the Dragon of Soul acted not out of strategy, but out of a primal, incandescent rage. The GPS tracker hidden in Carla's worn stuffed bunny, a precaution Ji-hwan had installed the night he discovered the truth, led him to a derelict warehouse on the edge of the Han River. It was a fortress of rusted steel and shadow, crawling with men who thought they understood the monster they had provoked. They were wrong. Ji-hwan arrived like a storm. He moved through the warehouse with a clinical, terrifying fluidity, a shadow in a tailored suit that had become a shroud. He didn't use a silencer, he wanted them to hear him coming. Every gunshot was a punctuation mark in a letter of vengeance. He was no longer the businessman or the calculating CEO, he was the man who had survived Incheon, the man who was now paying a blood debt to a ghost. To his rivals, he looked like a demon, his eyes cold and fixed, but in his mind, he saw only a little girl in a red dress who believed he was a hero. When he reached the inner office, he found the rival leader holding Carla by the arm, a blade glinting in the dim light. The man started to speak, to negotiate, to gloat, but he never finished. Ji-hwan didn't hesitate. He closed the distance with a speed that defied the laws of the room. He was a monster, yes, but he was her monster. Within seconds, the rival leader was on the floor, and the only sound left in the cavernous space was the heavy, ragged breathing of a man who had stared into the abyss and refused to blink. Ji-hwan dropped his weapon, the metal clattering loudly against the concrete. His hands, usually so steady when holding a gun or signing $1 million contract, were trembling as he reached for the child. Carla stood in the center of the carnage, her red dress dusty, her eyes wide with tears. She didn't look at the fallen men or the blood on the floor. She looked at him. "Daddy," she sobbed, throwing her small arms around his neck. Ji-hwan pulled her into his chest, burying his face in her hair. He held her with a desperate, protective strength, feeling her heart beating rapidly against his own. In that moment, the Iron Throne was gone. The syndicate didn't matter. The empire didn't matter. He was just a man holding a child, proving that the most dangerous version of a monster is the one who has finally found something worth dying for. The transition of the Hio estate from a fortress of secrets to a home of life happened slowly, then all at once. The cold marble hallways that once echoed only with the heavy footsteps of bodyguards were now softened by the rhythmic patter of small shoes and the occasional, bright sound of a toddler's laughter. The obsidian desk in the study, once reserved for blood-stained ledgers, now frequently played host to a worn stuffed bunny and a scattering of crayon drawings. On a crisp autumn morning, Hio Ji-hwan stood before his floor-to-ceiling mirror, but he wasn't checking the alignment of a silver tie bar. Instead, he was kneeling, his sharp black suit pressing into the carpet as he carefully double-knotted the laces of a pair of tiny, sparkling sneakers. Carla stood before him in a fresh school uniform, her backpack nearly as large as she was, her dark eyes shining with an excitement that contained no trace of the terror from the warehouse. Beside them, Julie watched, her hands no longer clasped in nervous prayer but resting gently on Ji-hwan's shoulder. The hierarchy of the house had shifted irrevocably. Ji-hwan was still a man of immense power, his influence in the city had only grown as he moved his empire toward legitimate ventures. But the dragon had found a new purpose for his fire. He was no longer a king of a hollow mountain, he was a guardian of a legacy built on a debt of life. As they walked toward the black sedan waiting in the driveway, Ji-hwan didn't scan the perimeter for threats with his usual predatory suspicion. He was present, holding Carla's small hand in his own scarred palm. When they reached the gates of the primary school, he stopped and knelt one more time. "Remember what I told you?" he asked, his voice low and warm, a sound that would have been unrecognizable to his former rivals. "Be brave, like Daddy," Carla chirped, throwing her arms around his neck for a final squeeze. Ji-hwan watched her run toward the classroom doors, a small splash of color in the morning light. He thought of Kim Kong-dae, the man who had died so he could live, and felt a profound sense of peace. He had finally paid the debt, not with money, but by becoming the man the child believed him to be. He was still powerful, still a force to be reckoned with, but as he turned back to Julie and took her hand, he realized the truth that had once left him speechless. He wasn't just home because he was behind the walls of his estate, he was home because he was finally loved. The dragon had found his heart, and for the first time in his life, Hio Ji-hwan was whole.